up, guys? So today we're moving on into 13.2, which we're going to be looking at the properties of quadrilaterals. And remember, quad means four-sided. So we're going to have some four-sided figures, and we're going to be looking at some different properties that go along with each one of these, okay? All right, so let's jump into that. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at a parallelogram. So right now, just to let you know, everything that I'm going to talk about, if you look on the back side of your notes, there is going to be a chart that is actually going to help you remember all of this stuff as you go along. So right now, the word parallel on a parallelogram means the opposite sides are going to be parallel to each other. So what that means, if you look, these two sides are going to be parallel to each other. And then these two sides are going to be parallel to each other. That's what those little arrows mean. So again, parallelogram means the opposite sides are parallel to each other, which another way of thinking of it is they have the same slope, okay? So the next thing we're going to look at on a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent, okay? So that means right now, if I look at this side right here is going to be congruent to this side right here. And then this side over here will be congruent to this side over here. That's what those little marks mean. So again, opposite sides are parallel and opposite sides are congruent, okay? The next thing we're going to look at are the opposite angles are congruent. So if I look at the opposite angles, so right now if I look at this angle right here is also going to be congruent to that. If I look at this angle over here, I'm going to put 2 marks on it, would be congruent to this angle over here. So again, opposite angles are congruent in a parallelogram, okay? And then last thing, when we talk about, actually in the next unit or the next lesson, we'll end up looking at the diagonals of these. So right now, this is going to be the basis of your parallelogram. Again, opposite sides are parallel, so this one's parallel to that one, parallel. Opposite sides are congruent, and then opposite angles are congruent. So ladies and gentlemen, that's what makes up a parallelogram. So if you were given a shape and all this stuff is true, then that means it is indeed a parallelogram, okay? All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at a rectangle. So again, in reference to the back of your page or the back of your paper, there's going to be stuff that tells you what's going on with this rectangle. So the first thing, again, basically everything that is a parallelogram is going to make up a rectangle. So again, my opposite sides are going to be parallel, so that means this is parallel to this is parallel to that. Opposite sides are congruent, so this is congruent to that, this is congruent to that. Opposite angles would be congruent as well. So that would be congruent to that, and that would be congruent to that as well. But the only difference is that the angles are all going to be right angles. So in a rectangle, all 4 angles are going to be right angles in this, okay? So that means basically all of these combined means the opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent, and the angles are all going to be 90 degrees. So that's what makes up a rectangle in this case. Again, in the next lesson, we're going to be looking at the diagonals of those, okay? Let's jump over to a square. Okay, so right now a square is going to be actually a parallelogram and a rectangle combined basically, and a rhombus actually, okay? So everything that makes up those is going to be a square. The only difference between all of these is all the sides are going to be congruent. So again, I'm going to talk about all the opposite sides are parallel. So that means this side is parallel to this one, this side is parallel to this one, this side's congruent to that one, except on a square, all the sides are going to be congruent in this instance. And then all the angles are going to be 90 degrees. That's what ends up making up a square, okay? So I'm putting all these marks down on there to show you exactly what that means on all these. So again, opposite sides are parallel, all the angles are 90 degrees, and in a square, all the sides are going to be congruent to each other. So a square is basically going to end up showing you all of that stuff is combined into one, and that's what that back side of that chart is going to end up showing you, okay? Let's jump down to a rhombus. Okay, so now on a rhombus, the opposite sides are parallel. So that means this side is parallel to this one, and this side is parallel to this one. On a rhombus, all the sides are going to be congruent to each other in this, okay? And then on a rhombus as well, all the angles or the opposite angles are going to be congruent to each other as well. Okay, so again, the back side of your chart is going to end up showing this. So opposite sides are parallel, all the sides are congruent in the rhombus, and the opposite angles are congruent. Okay. Next, we're going to look at a kite. Okay, so the specific thing about a kite is that the opposite sides are going to end up being congruent, or they have basically one pair if you look at that. Okay, so right now if you end up looking at this, I'm going to have one pair of congruent angles. So that means this angle right here and this angle right here is going to end up being congruent. Okay, and this kite right here, or this line right here and this line right here would be congruent, as long as well with those two. So if you end up looking at a kite, your adjacent sides are going to end up being congruent to each other. Okay. Again, those are going to end up being congruent, and those two are going to be congruent to each other in a kite. Okay. And lastly, looking at a trapezoid. If you look, it's only going to have one pair of parallel sides. So that means this guy and this guy are going to be parallel to each other. And so that's the definition of a trapezoid, one pair of parallel sides. Okay. Now, if this is an isosceles trapezoid, that would mean these two are going to be congruent in an isosceles trapezoid, which would be this one and this one. But all of the time, those aren't actually going to end up being that way if we end up looking at it, okay? As long as, well, with a trapezoid, if I look at my base angles, this angle right here and this angle right here are going to end up being congruent, and this angle right here and this angle right here are going to end up being congruent as well, okay? If that's an isosceles trapezoid, okay? All right, so we're going to take all this info, and basically whenever they tell you, they give you a shape, you're going to use the properties of all these shapes to end up answering these questions as you go along. Okay, so let's jump over to example number 1. All right, so right now example number 1, it tells me use the parallelogram is shown below. We need to find the value of A and B. So right now, if you need to, on the back side of your paper, you have that chart, and you can look at the parallelogram information that you see. So right now on a parallelogram, you know that the opposite sides are going to be congruent to each other. So what that means is this side will be congruent to this side, and this side will be congruent to this side. So I can actually set up two different equations and actually solve for the values of A and B here. So right now let's go ahead and solve for A. So I know Ln and NT are congruent to each other because it's a parallelogram. So I'm going to do 5A plus 4, and I'm going to set it equal to 3A plus 8. So I'm going to subtract 3, which will give me 2. I'm going to subtract 4, which will give me 4. I'm going to divide by 2, which will end up giving me 2. So A is going to end up giving you 2 because these two are congruent to each other. Okay. Now these two are congruent to each other, and now I can find the value of B by setting it up. So 4B minus 2 is going to be equal to 3B plus 2. So I'm going to subtract 3, which will give me 1. I'm going to add 2, which will end up giving me 4. So B is going to end up giving you 4 in that instance. So again, I used the properties of parallelogram. They told me this is a parallelogram, so I know all of the stuff on the back of your paper is to be true, so I can use that to find my answer. Okay? Let's look at my next one. Okay, so on my next one, it says parallelogram STUR is shown below. We need to find the measures of angle S. So right now, that means I need to solve for X here, okay? So right now in a parallelogram, I'm dealing with my angles. I know that my opposite angles are congruent, but also what you need to know is that if I look at these are technically, if my sides are going to be parallel to each other. So that means this line is parallel to this one. So with this being said, this is technically parallel lines with the transversal through it. So that means angle S here and angle R are going to be supplementary. S and U would end up being equal to each other, but S and R are going to be supplementary to each other. So S plus R is going to equal 180 degrees. Okay? So right now S is going to be 3x plus 50. R is going to be 2x minus 10. I'm going to combine like terms, so 3 and 2 give me 5. 50 and negative 10 would end up giving you 40. I'm going to subtract 40, which is going to end up giving me 140, and then I'm going to divide by 5. So 140 divided by 5 is going to end up giving me 28. So X is equal to 28. But now if you look, it wants the measure of angle S. So I got to plug X back into S. So it's going to be 3 times 28 plus 50. So 3 times 28 plus 50 is going to end up giving me 134. So the measure of angle S is going to be 134 in that instance. So again, just to recap, since my two lines are parallel to each other, they have a transversal going through them. So that means these two angles are going to be supplementary to each other because they're same side interior angles. Okay, let's jump into example number 3. Okay, looking at example number 3, it says a trapezoid ABCD is shown below. What is the value of X? Now, if you look in this instance, this is an isosceles trapezoid because I have these two lines and these two lines. They have the same amount of marks there, so that means those are congruent to each other. So that means BA and CD are going to be equal. So I could solve X just by creating an equation. So that means 3X minus 3 is going to equal X plus 5. I'm going to subtract X, which will give me 2X. I'm going to add 3, which is going to give me 8. I'm going to divide by 2, which is going to end up giving me 4. So X is going to end up being 4. Remember, I just used the information of an isosceles trapezoid, meaning those two sides are going to be congruent to each other. Now, if it wanted me to find the actual side, I would plug that back in for X and solve for the equation to get the value of X, okay? Or the value of the side. Now let's look at my next one here. All right, lastly, on example number 4, it says the angle measure for kite JKLM is shown below. What is the measure of angle J and angle L in this instance, okay? So right now I know for a kite, these opposite sides are going to end up being, or these opposite angles are going to be congruent to each other in this. So right now, since actually in the 3.1 lesson, we learned that a quadrilateral is actually going to add up to 360 degrees. So that means all of those angles are going to add up to 360 with this, okay? So that means 44 and 80 is going to give you 124. And then plus, I know these two angles are going to be equal to each other, so 2x is going to equal 360 degrees. So I'm going to subtract 124, so 360 minus 124 is going to give me 236. And then I'm just going to divide by 2 on both sides. So 236 divided by 2 is going to be 118. So that means both J and L are going to equal 118 degrees. Because I know in a kite, those two opposite angles there are going to be congruent to each other in a kite, okay? So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to take all this stuff. If you ever need help with any of this, please call me over. I can help you out. Other than that, good luck on your skill check. I'll talk to you soon.